Hello and welcome. In 2020, I reviewed the recently concluded Doomsday Clock, written by Geoff Johns and illustrated by the superb Gary Frank. It's a series I knew I had to revisit at some point to reevaluate it and see if my opinion changed. It did. Unfortunately, it got dramatically worse. As a brief refresher, Doomsday Clock acts as the final, long-delayed finale in the Rebirth storyline. It's also an official sequel to Watchmen. And finally, it connected all the various universe-changing events into one tidy continuity package. So it has a lot of work to do. It's worth saying, if you read it strictly as a Rebirth type of story, like Johns did with Green Lantern and The Flash, then it's perfectly fine. Sincerely, the story is no better or worse than those two projects. Furthermore, as an explanation that ties together the various changes in continuity and the time flexibility of the DC universe, it also works. However, with Doomsday Clock, Johns was clearly trying to produce a mature piece of work that emulated the original Watchmen. In that respect, the series is a catastrophic disaster. That's not a hot take. Its adherence to the form of the original, such as the 9-panel grid and the covers acting as the first panel, then using the main characters of Watchmen and the dire, apocalyptic tone, are clear signs that Johns was doing his best to create a solid sequel that lived up to the original. But it doesn't. It's not even close. It's like a bad essay on why Watchmen worked by someone who really didn't understand why it worked. Now, I don't like writing overly negative pieces. Believe it or not, I really don't. Especially about a writer who has done some very solid mainstream work. However, sometimes it's necessary to look at something that fails and examine why it fails. To begin with, the main characters in Watchmen had a specific purpose that is easily defined. Veidt is the one who conceives and enacts a plan to save the world. Blake inspires that plan and eventually discovers it. Veidt kills Blake to protect that plan. Rorschach investigates Blake's murder. Dan, then Laurie, are pulled into the investigation. Their purpose is to investigate the sleight-of-hand murder mystery that appears to be the plot of Watchmen. Through them, the actual plot is revealed. Dr. Manhattan is the final complication in Veidt's plan. He has to be removed for it to succeed. Now, that's a very basic look at the main characters. They all have a place in the jigsaw puzzle that is Watchmen. Remove one, and the plot doesn't quite work. Although one could argue that removing Dan or Laurie wouldn't affect where the series lands, and that's probably true. However, both are good foils for the other characters, and they add a little texture to the story. So on the surface, they don't appear to be overly useful, but they're not extraneous. The same cannot be said about Doomsday Clock. You can, in fact, remove at least 3 main characters and get the same results. The characters, the mime and marionette, who are updated, psychotic interpretations of Punch and Julie, and Rorschach, have no effect whatsoever on the outcome of events. In fact, Veidt including them makes very little sense. As stated in the series, Veidt needed the marionette for his plans. Veidt then needed Rorschach to break the marionette out of prison. Why it had to be this new Rorschach is not clear. Veidt could have easily disguised himself as Rorschach and carried out that task. During this prison break, Marionette demands the mime come along. So on the surface, you can see the logic and why things happened as they did. But once you look at the details, they make no sense. Let's analyze Veidt's initial plan, because he comes up with 2 in the series. The first plan is to travel to the DC universe in Night Owl's ship, locate Dr. Manhattan, then convince Manhattan to return to the Watchmen universe and set things right. Veidt needed the marionette to remind Manhattan of a time when he acted in a humane manner. The hope being that once Manhattan is reminded of his humanity, he would agree to help save the Watchmen universe. It's a plan based on hope, and the concept of hope is a major theme. But, logically, all Veidt needed to do was locate Manhattan and say, "Hey John, remember when you didn't kill Marionette because she was pregnant?" Her actual presence wasn't necessary to remind Manhattan of something he could perfectly recall on his own. Would Manhattan, who sees no intrinsic difference between a live body and a dead one, be swayed by the presence of a human being he once spared? That's a very flimsy presumption on Veidt's part. So what was the benefit of Veidt complicating his plan and including more variables than necessary? There is no benefit. All it did was include 3 characters that were, at best, unnecessary complications. They served no story purpose whatsoever. They are subplots that could be entirely removed, and their impact on the overall story would be hardly noticeable. Something that stood out is Johns doesn't understand Dr. Manhattan's abilities, specifically Manhattan's ability to time travel. He can't, and he doesn't at any point in Watchmen. Manhattan always exists in the current time. However, he's able to recall and experience the past and the future with perfect clarity, like he's actually there, but he isn't. He cannot affect events that have already occurred or ones that are about to occur. He is locked into the past and the future. He is, as he described himself in Watchmen, a puppet that can see the strings, which doesn't make him a puppet master, it makes him self-aware, and how he is incapable of changing anything that has happened or is about to happen. If it was possible for him to travel through time and change the outcome of events, he might have experimented with that in his own universe. But he did not, because he could not, because that's not what happened. That is fatalism, folks, and Manhattan is a fatalistic being. It may be hard to wrap one's head around the concept, but despite his seemingly omnipotent abilities, Manhattan cannot change anything that has happened or will happen. So, Manhattan cannot go back in time and slightly change history to see the results. He would have to change history, knowing that he always changed history. Now, one could argue the properties of the DC universe allow him to time travel. That would be a fair argument if it was stated or implied in the text, but it isn't. In my opinion, Johns likely presumed no one would have an issue with Manhattan playing with time and experimenting with the results. It would make sense that a seemingly omnipotent being would have that ability, but he doesn't. One of Manhattan's motivations is trying to determine why, at a certain point, there's a black spot he can't see beyond. The implication being that Superman destroys him. So, what is it that creates that hole in Manhattan's perception? There is nothing, literally nothing that explains it. It happens because Johns needs it to happen, to create tension and to motivate Manhattan. But wait, Manhattan says, everything ends, as a callback to a famous moment in Watchmen, and then the DC Metaverse reboots. So that's the reason for the hole in Manhattan's perception. That would be a perfect explanation, if Manhattan's knowledge blacked out at that exact moment. But it doesn't, it happens moments later. Superman flies past Manhattan, they have a brief exchange. Superman offers an explanation for the darkness Manhattan sees, and then it blacks out. Also, the metaverse doesn't exactly reboot, it just fades out for dramatic monologuing purposes, and the scene resumes a moment later. So the black spot that occurs is cheap theatrics to manufacture tension that doesn't have any real foundation other than plot necessity. Veidt's second plan is an area where the series falls apart completely. In essence, he uses the ongoing turmoil over the Superman theory to manipulate a series of events. While he may be a smart man and capable of visualizing such a plot, he has no resources to achieve it. In Watchmen, a similar world-saving plan took decades and many millions of dollars to put into action. Yet somehow, Veidt does the same thing in the DC universe after being there for only a few days. Overall, he doesn't have the power to exert any influence over worldwide events. Sure, this is ultimately a superhero story, so it doesn't have to adhere to reality, but it has to be somewhat logical. The entire Superman theory and the ensuing riots it inspires is mildly ridiculous. Its intent is to feed into the idea that Superman was the first and the greatest superhero. He's the one that inspired others to greatness. In a metatextual sense, that's hard to disagree with, but its execution is very forced. What feeds the riots is the theory that the American government created superheroes in staged accidents or whatever. It's eventually proven that did happen in a few cases. However, until that point, late in the series, it's a conspiracy theory with barely any evidence to support it, yet everyone believes it for some reason. Mainly, the outrage the Superman theory causes is disproportionate and highly unbelievable. Furthermore, it lacks any escalation. It begins at a high level of acceptance and has nowhere to go. I'm going to give Johns some credit for creativity, even though it's something that's probably based on Grant Morrison's hypertime and the DC Universe's self-awareness. Regardless, Johns cogently explains the metaverse, which is the mainline DC universe. Through the decades, continuity has changed. Time has flexed in order to give characters more modern origins. Ultimately, the reason for that is Superman. Now, the foundation for the metaverse is hope, and Superman, who currently embodies hope, is the focal point. In my opinion, that's pretty cheesy, but it works as a baseline justification for the existence of the DC multiverse. It's non-brand corporate message. Superheroes, when they're at their best, personify hope during hopeless times. Yes, that does sound like faint praise, but I do genuinely mean that, conceptually, as an explanation for the flexibility of DC continuity, it works quite well. It also works to explain how the multiverse arises. It makes sense that a self-aware universe could replicate itself, reboot from the beginning, and start over during these times. Also, the explosion of Krypton being the Big Bang is a nice touch. In the end, Doomsday Clock tries to have a high-concept, metaphysical approach to superheroes. Simultaneously, it has a dense, overly complicated plot, a mature tone, and a somber atmosphere. However, these aspects are neither challenging nor revealing in any meaningful capacity. The complexity they attempt to represent is very surface level. Basically, Doomsday Clock tries to be Watchmen in scale and tone, but it's very simplistic in execution. The series works as a straightforward, action-oriented story. It incorporates the history of the DC Universe with a reasonably coherent story, and then it gives that history a slightly new context. It's something that could have probably fit into 4 or 5 issues, yet it's padded and expanded with characters and subplots that go nowhere and mean nothing. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Your ongoing support makes it possible for this channel to continue. I appreciate every single one of you. Please subscribe if you've not already. Leave a comment and a like. I try to keep ads and self-promotional bits like this to a minimum, so if you can, consider directly supporting this channel on Patreon. Extra special thanks to Eidolon, Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sickin, Francis De La Cruz, Russell Bull, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrew, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Brian Deaton, Tom Granis, John Gaunt, James Graham, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Until next time.